I was in my mid-20s, trying to build a career. On paper, things were going well, but in reality, I was falling apart. Every work event, every client meeting, every simple happy hour was a special kind of hell for me. My social anxiety had gotten so bad that I would feel a wave of pure dread wash over me days in advance. My heart would start pounding, my hands would get slick with sweat, and I'd spend the entire time rehearsing sentences in my head that I would never actually say. I was certain my career was going to crash and burn simply because I couldn't handle a basic conversation. I finally broke down and went to see my primary care doctor. I told him everything. I told him I couldn't sleep, that I felt like a fraud, and that the constant fear was making me physically sick. I brought up benzodiazepines, like Xanax or Klonopin. I knew people who took them, and they seemed to work. But I told him I was terrified of getting addicted. I had heard the horror stories. That's when he smiled. He leaned back in his chair and told me he had the perfect solution, a newer, better drug. He said it was called gabapentin. He pitched it to me like a miracle. He said it would give me all the calming, pro-social effects of a benzodiazepine without any of the risks. He used the exact words completely safe and non-addictive. He explained that it wasn't a controlled substance, that doctors handed it out like candy because it was so harmless. It was the perfect answer, a way to fix my brain without any of the messy consequences. I walked out of that office with the prescription slip in my hand, feeling lighter than I had in years. I felt like I had just been given a secret key, one that would finally let me be the person I was supposed to be. I had no idea that I was just trading one prison for another. At first, it was a miracle. I took the first pill an hour before a big team lunch, and the usual knot of terror in my stomach just dissolved. The constant buzzing static in my brain went quiet. I could actually follow conversations and laugh at jokes without feeling like an alien trying to mimic human behavior. I felt normal. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't fighting my own mind. I thought, this is it. He was right. I'm saved. That feeling lasted for a few weeks. Then, slowly, the magic started to wear off. The familiar dread began to creep back in. The dosage that had once made me feel smooth and confident was now barely taking the edge off. I called the doctor, my voice tight with panic. I told him it wasn't working anymore. He was completely unconcerned. He told me to double the dose. When I called back a month later, he told me to double it again. He said my body was just adjusting, and that some of his patients were on dosages 3 or 4 times what I was taking. He kept saying the word safe over and over. I trusted him completely. So I kept upping the dose. The anxiety stayed more or less at bay, but something else started to happen. A thick, crippling brain fog descended on me. I'd be in the middle of a sentence at work and the next word would just vanish. It would be right there, on the tip of my tongue, and I just couldn't make the connection to say it out loud. It was humiliating. I'd trail off, pretend I lost my train of thought, and feel my face burning with shame. I'd walk into a room and have no idea why I was there. I missed appointments. I'd forget entire conversations I'd had with my partner just hours before. But I never once blamed the gabapentin. The doctor said it was safe, it was non-addictive, it was the good one. In my mind, this had to be my anxiety. It was getting worse, evolving, finding a new way to ruin my life. I was convinced my brain was just more broken than I thought, and the only answer was to keep taking the one thing that gave me any relief at all. Then the opportunity I'd been working for finally came. It was an interview for a position that felt like the final boss of my career path. Getting this job would change everything. The night before, I could barely sleep. The familiar dread was back, clawing at my stomach. I laid out my suit, ironed my shirt, and planned my morning down to the minute. My strategy was simple. Take what I thought was an extra strong dose of gabapentin an hour before I left the house. I needed to be sharp, calm, and confident. I needed the magic to work just one more time. I walked into the sleek, quiet office building, feeling strangely disconnected. The gabapentin had kicked in, and the initial wave of anxiety had been blunted. But it was replaced by a kind of fuzzy, muffled distance from everything around me. I sat down in the conference room across from a man and a woman. They smiled. I smiled back. We went through the basic handshakes and introductions. So far, so good. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. Maybe this was going to be fine. The man started. "So," he said, looking at my resume, "can you tell us about a time you had to lead a project and what the outcome was?" It was a standard question, an easy question. I had a dozen answers practiced for this exact moment. I opened my mouth to speak, and nothing happened. There was just a dial tone in my head, a complete and total emptiness where my thoughts were supposed to be. I could see the memory of the project in my mind's eye, like a movie playing on a distant screen, but I couldn't find the words to describe it. It was like the cable connecting my brain to my mouth had been cut. My heart started to pound. A hot flush of shame crept up my neck and spread across my face. I stammered. Yes, there was a project." Silence. The two of them just stared at me, their polite smiles starting to look strained. I tried again. We had a goal. The words felt thick and foreign in my mouth. I was speaking like someone who had just learned the language, stringing together basic nouns with huge, agonizing pauses in between. The more I panicked, the more the fog thickened. Every coherent thought I tried to grasp would just dissolve into static. The woman eventually cut in, her voice gentle but firm. "Okay," she said, with a look that was pure pity. "Maybe we can move on." They asked a few more simple yes or no questions, but the damage was done. I could barely make eye contact. The rest of the interview was a blur of humiliation. I just wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. When it was over, they said, "We'll be in touch," in that tone of voice that means you will never hear from them again. I remember walking out of the building and into the bright sunlight. I felt nauseous. I had just self-destructed in the most important meeting of my life. It wasn't my anxiety this time, not the way I knew it. This was something else. It was like a part of my brain had just been turned off. I stumbled to my car, got in, and just sat there in the driver's seat, staring at nothing, completely and utterly broken. I don't know how I drove home. I remember my hands on the steering wheel, but I don't remember the roads. When I got back to my apartment, I walked to the medicine cabinet and stared at the amber prescription bottle. Gabapentin. Completely safe. The doctor's smiling, confident face flashed in my mind. The interview played back in my head on a loop. The blankness. The dial tone where my thoughts should have been. It wasn't my anxiety. It was the drug. It had to be. That night was the beginning of the real nightmare. I fell down a rabbit hole of internet forums and patient support groups. I found thousands of people telling my exact story. The initial relief, the escalating doses, the crippling brain fog, the lost words, the memory gaps. They all called it GABA brain. They all talked about doctors who dismissed their concerns, who told them it was their underlying condition, who just kept writing bigger prescriptions. I saw the phrase non-addictive written over and over, always as a bitter joke. I wasn't broken. I was poisoned. I decided to quit right then. I thought I could just stop. That was a stupid mistake. The withdrawal hit me like a train within 24 hours. It was a level of hell I didn't know existed. My anxiety came back, but it wasn't the old social fear. This was a raw, chemical terror that had no source and no end. I had brain zaps, these horrible electric shocks that would jolt through my skull every few minutes. I was drenched in sweat but freezing cold. I couldn't sleep for days. The only way out was to go back on the drug and start a taper. A painfully slow, agonizing taper that took me the better part of a year. I had to buy a jeweler's scale to weigh out my doses, shaving off a few milligrams every week, praying I wouldn't send myself back into full-blown withdrawal. Every single day was a fight just to feel semi-human. The whole time, I knew that interview was gone. That opportunity, the one I had burned my life's candle at both ends to get, had been stolen from me by a safe pill and a doctor I trusted. I got off it eventually. The fog lifted, but the scar is permanent. I never got another chance at a job like that. My career path was fundamentally altered by that 1 hour of humiliating silence. But the deeper scar is the trust I lost. I no longer believe in easy answers from men in white coats. I learned that the medical system can gaslight you, drug you into a stupor, and then blame you for falling. They broke my mind and then told me it was my fault. It's a lesson you don't forget. My job was my life, and my life was killing me. I was a consultant, which is a fancy word for someone who lives in airports and sterile hotel rooms, running on coffee and paranoia. The pressure was constant. Every week was a new city, a new client, a new high-stakes presentation that my company was counting on. I was good at my job, but I was paying for it every single night. The moment my head hit the pillow, my brain would just ignite. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every conversation from the day, rehearsing my talking points for the next morning, and worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. My nerves were so frayed that I felt a constant, low-level hum of anxiety under my skin. I finally booked an appointment with a doctor during a rare 2-day break at home. I told him everything. I told him I couldn't shut my brain off, that I was so tired I felt physically sick. But the moment I tried to rest, my thoughts would just start racing again. I needed a switch. I just wanted an off switch for my brain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he grabbed his prescription pad. He said insomnia from work stress was incredibly common. He wrote a script for Ambien. He told me to just take one before bed. He made it sound as simple as taking an aspirin for a headache. It was just a tool to get the job done. The first time I took it, I was in a hotel in Denver with a massive client review the next day. The kind of meeting that my entire year's bonus depended on. Normally, I'd be a wreck. I'd be pacing the room, tweaking my presentation slides until 2 a.m. Instead, I took one of the small pills with a glass of water. I remember laying down and pulling the covers up to my chin. The next thing I remember was the hotel's alarm clock blasting next to my ear. It was 6:30 a.m. The sun was just coming up. I had a moment of pure panic, thinking I'd overslept. But then I realized there was no in-between. No tossing and turning, no waking up at 3 a.m. with a jolt of anxiety, no bizarre stress dreams. I had simply closed my eyes, and then it was morning. I sat up. I didn't feel groggy or hungover. I felt rested, deeply, completely rested. The static in my head was gone. The knot of dread in my stomach wasn't there. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. It was a miracle. This tiny pill had given me a perfect, black, dreamless void. For a corporate soldier like me, it was the perfect weapon. I thought to myself, this is it. This is the fix. It all started with a credit card alert. We were having breakfast a few weeks later, and my wife was scrolling through her phone. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. She asked me if I'd bought a vintage life-size taxidermy badger the night before. I laughed. I told her, of course not. Why would I do that? She turned her phone around and showed me the confirmation email. $350 from some weird auction site, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. I had absolutely no memory of it. Not a flicker. I assumed it was some kind of scam, a phishing email. I told her I'd call the bank and sort it out. I didn't think much of it until a week later when a giant box showed up at our front door. Inside was a very real, very dead, glass-eyed badger. We sent it back, but I couldn't explain how it got there. I just brushed it off as a half-asleep mistake. I must have been browsing on my phone in bed and bought it without realizing. Then the text messages started. My wife would ask me about conversations we'd supposedly had in the middle of the night. Things I never remembered saying. One morning, a colleague from work pulled me aside, looking confused. He asked if everything was okay. He showed me a text I had sent him at 3 a.m. It just said, "The numbers are soft, but the birds are loud." I had no idea what it meant. I had no memory of sending it. I played it off as a joke, some weird autocorrect fail. But I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I checked my sent folder and found a dozen other messages just like it, sent to random contacts. They were all nonsense. The breaking point was the kitchen. I woke up one morning to my wife standing in the doorway, just staring. The whole room was a disaster. There were pots on the stove, open jars on the counter, and a half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs and ketchup on the table. It looked like someone had cooked and eaten a full meal. I looked at the mess, and I felt nothing. It was like looking at a stranger's house. I had a complete and total blackout for the entire event. My wife looked at me, and her expression wasn't angry, it was scared. She asked me what was going on. I didn't have an answer. I just told her I was exhausted, that the stress from work was making me do weird things. I was sleepwalking, or sleep cooking, or sleep shopping. In my mind, it wasn't the Ambien. It couldn't be. The pill was the only thing holding me together. This was just my worn-out brain glitching. It was a quirk of exhaustion, and I just needed to push through it. The blackouts were getting harder to ignore, but work was still a pressure cooker. I was home for a couple of days between trips, and I was completely on edge. That afternoon, it all boiled over because of a parking spot. My neighbor cornered me as I was grabbing the mail. He started yelling that my car was 6 inches over the line of our shared driveway. It was ridiculous. He stood there, red-faced and screaming, jabbing his finger at my bumper. I'm not a confrontational person. Usually, I'd just apologize and move the car. But I was so wound up, so frayed from the lack of real sleep and the constant stress, that something inside me just snapped. I started yelling back. The argument was stupid and pointless, but at that moment it felt like the most important battle of my life. We just stood there in the driveway, two grown men screaming at each other about inches of asphalt. After a few minutes, I just walked away. I slammed my front doors shut, my heart hammering in my chest. I could still hear his muffled shouts through the door. I was shaking with a rage that felt white-hot and disgusting. I paced the living room, replaying the argument, thinking of all the things I should have said. The anger wouldn't go away. It was a loud, ugly noise in my head, and it wouldn't stop. I knew there was no way I was sleeping that night. Not with this fire burning in my brain. I wasn't thinking about rest anymore. I was thinking about escape. I just needed to turn everything off. I went straight to the bathroom, opened the medicine cabinet, and grabbed the bottle of Ambien. I didn't think about the taxidermy badger or the gibberish texts. All I could think about was the quiet, the perfect, dreamless void. This wasn't about sleep. This was about forcing a shutdown. I dry swallowed a pill, leaning against the sink, just waiting for the noise in my head to finally stop. The next thing I remember is a fist pounding on my front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was heavy and persistent, the kind that makes your stomach drop. I sat bolt upright in bed. The sun was just starting to filter through the windows, that weak, early morning light. My wife was already getting up, a confused and worried look on her face. I stumbled downstairs, my mind a complete blank. I opened the door to find 2 police officers on my porch. My neighbor was standing on his lawn a few feet behind them, still in his bathrobe, his face pale and furious. Before I could even ask what was going on, one of the officers asked me my name. I told him. He asked me to step outside. That's when I saw it. My neighbor's expensive silver sedan was destroyed. A deep, ugly scratch ran the entire length of the driver's side, white metal screaming through the dark paint. All 4 tires were completely flat, slumped against the asphalt. My neighbor started pointing at me, his voice shaking with rage. "That's him. He did it. I called it." I just stared at the car. I told the officers it wasn't me. I said I was asleep. I admitted that we'd had a stupid argument the day before, but I would never do something like this. I was telling the truth. I wouldn't. The real me wouldn't. One of the cops just looked at me, his expression unreadable. He said my neighbor had a new security camera system. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then turned it to face me. "Is this you, sir?" he asked. The video was grainy, lit in that spooky greenish night vision color. But it was unmistakably me. I was wearing the same clothes I'd had on during the argument. I watched myself walk out of my front door and across the driveway. I wasn't angry or yelling. I was completely calm. I walked with a slow, deliberate purpose, almost like I was in a trance. I saw myself pull my house key from my pocket, walk the length of his car, and just methodically drag the key across the paint. Then I knelt, just as calmly, and went from one tire to the next, puncturing each one. There was no emotion, no rage. I was like a robot performing a programmed task. I stared at the tiny screen, watching a version of myself I didn't know. The man in that video was a stranger. I looked from the phone to the officer's face. There was a black hole in my mind. A perfect silent void where that entire 50-foot walk should have been. I had zero memory of any of it. Not a flicker. It was like a piece of my life had been cleanly erased, and someone had pasted this horrible video in its place. I couldn't say anything. I just stared at the phone, then back at my neighbor's ruined car, then at my own hands. The hands that had held the key. The officer didn't need an answer. He put the phone away and told me to put my hands behind my back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the world. I don't remember the ride to the station. I just remember sitting in the back of the car, replaying that grainy video in my head. The calm, methodical way I moved. It wasn't me, but it was. The legal stuff ended up being a nightmare of its own. Felony vandalism charges. Thousands of dollars to a lawyer who got it pleaded down to a misdemeanor. More thousands to my neighbor to make him drop the civil suit. I lost my security clearance for work because of the arrest, which eventually cost me my job. My wife looked at me differently after that, with a little bit of fear in her eyes that never really went away. My life was effectively dismantled, piece by piece. But none of that was the real horror. The jail time I was facing, the money, even losing my job, that was all just consequence. The true, lasting terror is something I can't explain to a lawyer or a judge. It's the knowledge of the man in that video. The Ambien didn't just make me sleepwalk. It created something. An automaton that wore my face. A quiet, efficient criminal who wasn't driven by rage or emotion, just by a cold, simple task. It was an entirely different person living inside my skull. I flushed the pills. I'll never take another sleeping aid as long as I live. But the damage is done. The fear isn't about what I did. It's about what he did. Who is he? What else is he capable of? The doctor prescribed a pill to turn my brain off, but he just handed the keys to someone else. And now I have to live with the knowledge that there's a stranger who shares my body, waiting for another chance to get out. That's the real prison. I've had Crohn's disease since I was a teenager, but this flare-up was different. It wasn't just a bad few weeks. This was a complete and total siege. I was in my late 20s, and my body was shutting down. I couldn't eat anything without it turning into a stabbing, twisting pain that would leave me curled up on the bathroom floor for hours. I was losing weight so fast, it was like I was evaporating. I could see the panic in my family's eyes every time they looked at me. After 2 weeks of this, I was so weak I could barely walk. I ended up in my gastroenterologist's office. He took one look at me and told me we were past the point of gentle solutions. He said the inflammation was so severe that my intestines were in danger of perforating. That meant emergency surgery, a colostomy bag, a life changed forever. I was terrified. He told me there was one last option before we got to that point. He called it the nuclear option. He was putting me on a heavy dose of prednisone. It's a powerful corticosteroid, and he described it as the only thing strong enough to shock my system back into working. He said it would put out the fire. I remember asking him about the side effects. I was so exhausted I could barely form the words. He leaned back and sort of shrugged. He said, "Well, you might feel a little irritable. Maybe have some trouble sleeping." He said it with a wave of his hand, like he was talking about the side effects of an aspirin. It's a small price to pay to avoid major surgery, right? I agreed instantly. Irritable? I was already in agony. Of course I'd take it. I just wanted the pain to stop. I took the prescription from him, feeling a wave of hope for the first time in weeks. He was the doctor. He was going to save me. He never once mentioned psychosis. He never once mentioned mania. He just said irritable. The prednisone killed the pain in less than a day. The fire in my gut went out, but the drug lit a new fire in my brain. Suddenly, I had a surge of energy so intense it felt electric. I wasn't just free from pain, I felt powerful, almost superhuman. I stayed up the entire first night, cleaning the house from top to bottom, making huge, elaborate plans for my life. I wasn't tired at all. It felt like my mind was finally working at 100%. I didn't sleep the next night either. or the night after that. By the third day, the incredible energy had turned sour. It wasn't creative anymore. It was frantic. A constant, high-pitched buzz inside my skull that wouldn't stop. I would lie in bed with my eyes wide open, my heart hammering against my ribs for no reason. I felt wired, and my skin started to feel too tight for my body. That's when the paranoia started to creep in. I would hear my family talking in the kitchen, and I'd hear their voices drop to a whisper as soon as I walked into the room. I'd catch my name, and then silence. I knew they were talking about me. I was certain they thought I was losing my mind, and they were plotting what to do. Their concerned looks started to feel like suspicion. I tried to watch TV to drown out my thoughts, but that just made it worse. A news anchor was giving a report, and he looked straight into the camera. He said, "We are facing an unprecedented threat." His eyes seemed to lock onto mine through the screen. I knew he was talking about me. The television was sending me coded messages, warnings. I got up and pulled all the blinds shut. I felt eyes on me from every direction. I was convinced there was a car parked down the street watching my house. The quiet hum of the refrigerator started to sound like a hidden recording device. My own home wasn't my own anymore. It felt like a stage, and I was the only person who didn't know the script. The doctor said I might get irritable, but he never said that I'd become the main character in a conspiracy against myself. The quiet dread I felt before was gone. It was replaced by a certainty that was as sharp and clear as glass. They were coming for me. The men from the TV, the agents, the people who were whispering my name. I heard the house settle, a normal creak of wood. But in my mind, it was a footstep on the stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were no longer outside. They were in the house. I ran. I scrambled into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, twisting the flimsy lock on the knob. It felt useless, like a piece of paper. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something. Anything. The dresser. It was heavy, solid oak. I grabbed the handles and pulled. Adrenaline surged through me. I dragged it across the floor, the legs making a horrible scraping sound until it was jammed tight against the door. I was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. My wife had followed me into the room before I slammed the door. Now she was standing by the window, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "What are you doing?" she asked. "What's wrong?" Her voice was soft, pleading. It was a trap. I knew it. She was trying to calm me down, to make me feel safe so she could let them in. She was working with them. I could see it in her eyes. I just shook my head, not trusting my own voice, and backed away from her, toward the corner. The barricade wasn't enough. I was trapped. I was a cornered animal. A sound started to build in my chest, a pressure that had nowhere to go. It came out as a scream. It wasn't a word, just a raw, high-pitched noise of pure animal terror. I couldn't stop it. Through my own screaming, I saw my wife's face crumble. She backed away, her hand covering her mouth. Her other hand fumbled for her phone. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. I saw her press the screen, and I heard her voice, strained and cracking with tears. "I need help," she whispered into the phone. "My husband. I think he's having a breakdown. He's barricaded us in the bedroom. He's screaming." She was turning me in. She was calling her people to come get me. The last line of defense I thought I had was gone. I just pressed myself harder into the corner of the room and kept screaming. I don't remember the paramedics. I don't remember how they got past the dresser. The screaming in my head and the screaming from my mouth just fades into a black hole of missing time. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. I blinked at a white ceiling tile, trying to figure out where I was. Then I tried to move my arm and couldn't. I was strapped down, nylon restraints on both wrists, and I could feel them on my ankles too. A deep chemical exhaustion filled my bones. A psychiatrist came to talk to me after a day or two. He was calm. He explained that this was a known, if rare, side effect. He used the term steroid-induced psychosis. He said they were slowly tapering me off the prednisone and that the symptoms would fade as the drug left my system. And he was right. Over the next few days, the buzzing in my skull quieted down. The feeling of being watched went away. The television just became a television again. It was like a fever breaking. The delirium was gone, but the memory of it was perfectly intact. As my mind cleared, something else rushed in to take its place. It was a wave of pure, gut-wrenching shame. I could replay every moment in perfect detail. Dragging the dresser, seeing the terror on my wife's face, accusing her of being part of a conspiracy. I remembered the animal noise that came out of my throat. I remembered the way she cried when she called for help. I had terrorized the person I loved most in the world. The monster hadn't been in the walls or on the television. It had been me. The drive home from the hospital was silent. My wife kept her eyes on the road. When we walked in the door, our home felt like a stranger's house. Every room was a crime scene of my madness. I could see the fresh scratches on the wood floor in our bedroom where I had dragged the dresser. My wife tried to act normal. My kids tried to act normal, but it was a fragile, polite performance. They looked at me differently. I caught it in quick glances when they thought I wasn't watching. It was a look of caution, of fear. The physical pain from the Crohn's was gone, but the doctor's cure had done something so much worse. It had turned me into something my family had to be saved from. They don't look at a husband or a father anymore. They look at me, and they remember the monster. And I know they always will. My life was built on schedules and responsibility. I was a 42-year-old dad in the suburbs. I did everything by the book. I drove a sensible sedan, coached my daughter's softball team on Saturdays, and prided myself on my perfect attendance at PTA meetings. My biggest vice was putting too much charcoal in the grill during neighborhood cookouts. I wasn't the kind of person who had a drug story. I was the kind of person who listened to those stories on the news and shook his head. It all started with a ladder. I was cleaning the gutters, just like I did every autumn. I overreached, the ladder shifted, and I came down hard. I heard a sound in my knee like a thick branch snapping. It was a complete ACL tear. The orthopedic surgeon was very direct. He said the surgery was routine, but the recovery would be brutal. 6 to 9 months of intense physical therapy. He said managing the pain, especially in the first few weeks, would be the most important part of getting back on my feet. The surgery went fine. I woke up in the recovery room with my leg in a huge, stabilizing brace, feeling a deep, throbbing ache that was just beginning to push past the nerve block. The surgeon came by before I was discharged. He was friendly, confident. He wrote out a prescription and handed it to the nurse. "This will keep you comfortable," he said. "Just stay ahead of the pain. Take 1 pill every 4 to 6 hours, like clockwork." I got home and my wife helped me get settled on the couch. The pain started to build. It was a sharp, burning, bone-deep agony I had never experienced before. I looked at the clock. It was time. My wife brought me a small white pill and a glass of water. Oxycodone. I swallowed it. I had a little notepad ready to log the time, just like the doctor said. I was going to be the perfect patient. About 20 minutes later, the sharp edges of the pain began to blur. Then the pain dissolved completely, replaced by a soft, warm, peaceful quiet. The world just fell away. I remember thinking, this isn't so bad. This is just medicine. This is what you're supposed to do. The bottle ran empty on a Tuesday morning. I took the last pill, logged it in my little notebook, and felt a sense of accomplishment. The surgeon had given me a 30-day script, and I'd made it last 34 days by stretching the doses. I was being responsible. I figured the worst was over. Now it was just about physical therapy and getting strong again. By that night, the pain was back. But it was different. It wasn't the sharp, localized agony in my knee. It was a deep, gnawing ache that started in my back and spread through my whole body, down to my bones. I broke out in a cold sweat but felt like I was freezing. I couldn't sit still. My skin crawled, and my mind started to race with a nameless, jittery anxiety. I tossed and turned all night, my leg twitching. I told myself it was just the surgery, a setback, a bad nerve thing. The healing process wasn't a straight line, right? The next day, it was worse. It felt like I had a horrible case of the flu, but without the fever. My nose was running, my stomach was churning, and every joint in my body screamed. I called my surgeon's office, my voice tight with a panic I tried to hide. I explained the situation to the nurse. I told her the pain was back, that it was unbearable, that I couldn't function. She was polite but firm. The acute phase was over. There would be no more refills on the oxycodone. She told me to take ibuprofen and stick with my physical therapy. I hung up the phone and felt a wave of pure desperation. She didn't get it. They didn't understand. I wasn't some junkie looking for a fix. I was a man in legitimate, agonizing pain. I couldn't coach my daughter's team like this. I couldn't even sit through a meeting. I had to do something. I thought about the urgent care clinic a few towns over, the kind of place you go for a sore throat or a sprained ankle. I put on a collared shirt and my clean, sensible jacket. I made sure I looked the part. A respectable father, a responsible patient. Not a man who was starting to come apart at the seams. I limped into the clinic, leaning heavily on my knee brace for effect. I was called back to a small room, and a young, overworked-looking doctor came in. I gave him the performance of my life. I was articulate. I was calm. I explained the ACL surgery, the long recovery, how diligent I was with my PT. I described the pain in detail, the grinding, the burning, the way it radiated. I told him my surgeon was impossible to get a hold of, and I was just trying to stay ahead of the pain, just like I was told. I just wanted enough to get me through the next week or two, until this flare-up calmed down. He nodded, his expression softening with sympathy. He looked at me, a clean-cut suburban dad just trying to get back to his life. He saw my brace, he heard my story. He didn't see the desperation, he didn't see the lie. He just saw a patient in pain. He pulled out his prescription pad without a moment's hesitation. "This should hold you over," he said, writing out a script for Percocet. I felt a surge of relief so powerful, it almost made me dizzy. I had done it. I had won. I was still the perfect patient. I just had to find a doctor who understood. That new script of Percocet only lasted a week. When the last pill was gone, I wasn't even worried. I thought I had a system. I picked another urgent care clinic one town over, put on the same sensible jacket, and walked in leaning on my brace, ready to give my performance again. I was confident. I thought I had it all figured out. But this doctor was different. He wasn't young and overworked. He was older, and he had a hard look in his eyes. He listened to my whole story without a word, just typing on his computer. Then he stopped and swiveled the monitor so I could see it. My name was at the top of a list. There were dates, doctors' names, pharmacies. He pointed a finger at the screen. "This is the state's prescription monitoring database," he said. His voice was flat with no sympathy in it at all. "It says you just got a prescription for opioids filled last week. It says you got another one filled the month before that. You've been doctor shopping." The term hit me like a slap in the face. He told me my name was red flagged. He said no doctor in their right mind would write me another script. He looked at me like I was a piece of trash he had to scrape off his shoe. I left that office feeling a hot flush of shame. But the shame was quickly replaced by pure, uncut panic. He was right. I tried my primary care doctor, who suddenly couldn't see me for weeks. I tried another clinic. But the moment I gave them my ID, the pleasant nurse came back and said the doctor refused to see me. The doors were slamming shut, one by one. The system I thought I could outsmart was a fortress, and I was locked outside. And the whole time, the sickness was coming on. It wasn't like before. This was withdrawal in its final form. It felt like every bone in my body was on fire. My skin was clammy and crawling. I was either freezing under a mountain of blankets or drenched in a pool of my own sweat. I couldn't stop moving my legs. The respectable dad from the suburbs was gone. All that was left was a twitching, desperate animal who would do anything to make it stop. Lying on my couch in the middle of the night, shaking and nauseous, a name came into my head from a long, long time ago. A guy I knew from my teenage years, someone who always had a way of finding things. I hadn't spoken to him in 20 years, but I still had his number. It was a stupid, desperate long shot. My hand was trembling so hard, I could barely type. I made the call. He picked up, and his voice was exactly the same. I didn't have to say much. He understood immediately. We agreed to meet in a supermarket parking lot in an hour. I hung up the phone. For one single second, I felt a wave of relief. Then an even bigger wave of horror washed over me. I wasn't a patient anymore. I was a customer. I had just crossed a line I never, ever thought I would get close to. I was going to buy pills off a dealer in a parking lot. My two lives, the man on the sofa and the man in the sensible sedan, had just collapsed into one. I hung up the phone and the momentary relief instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a new, sharper kind of panic. I had a way to get the pills, but my old acquaintance didn't take credit cards. He wanted cash. The deal was in less than an hour, and it was the middle of the night. The sickness was peaking. It felt like my blood had been replaced with acid and ground glass. I stumbled into the kitchen, my whole body twitching, and yanked open my wallet. A $5 bill and a few receipts. I tore through the junk drawer, my hands shaking so badly I was just knocking things over. Old batteries, coupons, a book of stamps, nothing. The banks were closed. I didn't have time for an ATM, and I probably didn't have enough in my account anyway. A guttural, strangled noise of pure desperation came out of my throat. Then I saw it. On the little table by the door, there was a pile of colorful envelopes. It was my daughter's birthday 2 days ago. Her cards were all stacked there, waiting for me to deposit the cash into her savings account. like I always did. Like a good father would do. I froze. A voice in my head, the last remnant of the man I used to be, was screaming. No, not that. Anything but that. The sickness answered in a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The animal part of my brain knew. It was the only way. It was the only money in the house. My feet moved on their own. I walked over to the table and picked up the top card. It had a cartoon princess on the front. I could see her name written on the envelope in my mother's familiar handwriting. I fumbled it open with trembling fingers. Inside, my daughter's smiling school picture was paper-clipped to a $50 bill. I stared at her face, at her missing front tooth, and I felt nothing but the gnawing, clawing need. I pulled the bill out. Then I opened another card and another, a 20 from her aunt, a 10 from a neighborhood friend. I didn't stop until I had opened all of them. I just stood there in the quiet house, a crumpled pile of cartoon characters and loving messages on the floor at my feet. In my hand was a small, messy stack of cash. It was enough. The relief didn't come. There was no wave of peace. There was just a cold, dead space in my chest. I wasn't a patient in pain anymore. I wasn't a man trying to get back on his feet. The man who coached softball and worried about the PTA was dead. Right there, in the middle of his own kitchen, he had been replaced by a man who steals from his own daughter's birthday cards just to stop the shaking. The next morning, I walked downstairs and found her at the kitchen table. The crumpled birthday cards were spread out in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. She had the one from my mother in her hand, the one with my daughter's school picture still clipped to the inside. But the $50 bill was gone. Her face was pale. She wasn't crying. She was just still. It was a stillness that was far more terrifying than any shouting I could have imagined. She looked up at me. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. "Where is her money, Mark?" I opened my mouth to lie. The excuse was right there. I took it to deposit it. I put it somewhere safe. But I couldn't say the words. The look on her face, the dead certainty in her eyes, just stripped everything away. The lie died in my throat. So I told her. The truth came out in a quiet, ugly rush. About the pills running out, about the sickness, about the urgent care clinics and the phone call in the middle of the night, about the cash, about everything. I expected her to scream. I expected her to throw something at me. She did neither. She just listened. When I was finished, she stood up, walked to the hallway, and came back with a black duffel bag. She dropped it at my feet. "You need to leave," she said. There was no argument in her voice. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sky is blue or that fire is hot. She said, "The person who did this can't live here." She wasn't just kicking me out, she was erasing me. I packed a few things in a daze. I could hear my daughter upstairs, playing in her room, humming a song from a cartoon. I walked out the front door of the house I had painted, with the lawn I had mowed and the garden my wife and I had planted together. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see, left. That night, in a cheap motel room that smelled like stale smoke, the whole thing finally hit me. I traced the line back. It wasn't a long, complicated path. It was a straight shot from a surgeon's office to this room. From a legitimate prescription for a torn ACL to stealing birthday money from my own child. I had followed the doctor's orders. I had been the perfect patient. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a patient and become just another junkie. The respectable suburban dad was a costume I had been wearing. This, sitting on the edge of a stained bedspread with nothing but a bag and a handful of pills, this was who I was now. I've never been someone who sits still. Even in my 60s, I was the one leading the hiking group, the one who could spend 8 hours in the garden and still have energy to cook dinner for my grandkids. I felt strong. I had my aches and pains, sure, but my mind was sharp and my body was willing. I thought I had another 20 years of good, active life ahead of me. Easy. Then a small problem started to get bigger. It was my bladder. It started as just a little annoyance, that feeling of urgency that makes you mentally map out every public restroom before you even leave the house. But it got more persistent. It started interrupting my sleep. It made me hesitate to go on long walks with my friends, worried I'd get caught a mile from the nearest bathroom. It was a stupid, embarrassing, and inconvenient problem, and it was starting to dictate my life. I finally brought it up to my doctor during my annual physical. I was a little embarrassed, but he just nodded like it was the most boring thing he'd heard all day. I explained that it was a mild case, that it wasn't ruining my life, but it was chipping away at my freedom. I just wanted to feel normal again. He smiled, that quick, dismissive doctor smile. He said it was extremely common. He pulled out his prescription pad. "We have an easy fix for that," he said. He scribbled something down. "It's a drug called oxybutynin. It's very routine, completely harmless. It just calms the muscle down. You won't even know you're on it." He handed me the slip of paper. Nothing to worry about at all. I took the prescription and felt a wave of relief. It was that simple. A harmless pill for a nuisance problem. I was finally going to get back to my life. No more planning my day around bathroom breaks. I thought I had just been given the key back to my freedom. I had absolutely no idea that I was trading an inconvenience for a thief that was going to steal my memory, my personality, and my entire sense of self. The first week on oxybutynin was perfect. The annoying, persistent urgency was just gone. I could go on my long hikes again without a flicker of worry. I felt free. The doctor was right. It was an easy fix. And just like he said, I didn't even know I was on it. I just felt like my old self again. The first sign that something was wrong was in the garden. I was on my knees, weeding the rose bed, and I looked over at a patch of tall purple flowers. I'd planted them myself a decade ago. I knew their name as well as I knew my own. But in that moment, it was just gone. A complete blank. I stared at them, my mind a quiet, empty room where the name should have been. I laughed it off as a senior moment, but it left a cold little stone in my stomach. A few days later, I was telling my granddaughter a story, one of my old favorites about a hiking adventure from my 20s. I got to the punchline, the big finish, and I just stopped. The rest of the story had vanished. It was like a film that just snapped in the projector. I just sat there, mouth half open, while she stared up at me, waiting. I had to pretend I was just tired. The doctor said it was harmless. He didn't mention it would steal the names of my own flowers from my head. He didn't warn me about the blank spaces where my memories were supposed to be. It started so small, almost too small to pin down. But that's how these stories always seem to begin. It's never a gunshot. It's a quiet click of a lock. It always starts with a prescription slip, a reassuring smile, and a promise. The promise that a safe pill will fix your anxiety, right before it erases your thoughts in the most important meeting of your life. The promise of an off switch for your brain, just before it hands the keys to a quiet, methodical criminal who wears your face. The promise that you might get a little irritable. not that you'll end up barricaded in a room, screaming at the person you love most. The promise that you're just managing pain, right up until the moment you're stealing birthday money from your own child. All of these stories start the same way, with a problem that feels unbearable and a doctor who has an easy answer. They wield their prescription pads like magic wands, offering a shortcut through the pain, the fear, the sleepless nights, the simple inconvenience. They sell you a cure. What they don't tell you is the price. They don't tell you that the true cost isn't listed on the bottle. It's a career path you'll never get back, a family that looks at you with fear, a person in the mirror you no longer recognize, a life you once had, dismantled piece by piece, all because you put your trust in the one person you're taught to believe will, above all else, do no harm.